This video contains audio content only. There are no visual elements or images accompanying the audio. If you're expecting to see video footage, please note that this is an intentional audio-only presentation. We recommend listening to this content rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding and enjoy the audio. Welcome. This exploration of the Rwandan genocide will unravel a complex history in easy-to-understand language. We'll journey from pre-colonial Rwanda, where Hutu and Tutsi identities were fluid, through the devastating impact of Belgian colonialism and the rise of the Hutu Power ideology. We'll examine the international community's tragic inaction and the subsequent struggle for reconciliation. Prepare to gain a deeper understanding of this horrific event and the ongoing quest for healing and unity in Rwanda. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Division. The story of Rwanda, before the arrival of Europeans, is not one of neatly defined racial groups locked in perpetual conflict, but a more intricate narrative of shared existence, fluid identities, and evolving social structures. For centuries, the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa peoples, collectively known as the Banyarwanda, wove a complex tapestry of life in the heart of the African Great Lakes region. They shared a common tongue, Kinyarwanda, a vibrant culture rich in song, dance, poetry, and storytelling, and a land they called home. Journey back to a time long before written records, and you encounter the Twa, the earliest inhabitants of this land. These pygmy hunter-gatherers, skilled in navigating the forests, carved out their existence amidst the verdant hills and valleys. Their ancient presence continues to echo in Rwanda today, a testament to their enduring connection to the land. Over time, Bantu groups, including those who would become the Hutu, migrated to the region, bringing with them the knowledge of agriculture. They cleared the forests, cultivated the land, and established a way of life centered around farming. Their arrival marked a significant shift in the landscape and laid the foundation for a more settled existence. Later still, perhaps around the 14th century, arrived another Bantu group, the Tutsi. Their pastoralist tradition, centered on cattle herding, brought a new dimension to Rwandan society. These were not conquering hordes, but groups integrating into the existing social fabric, often through intermarriage and cultural exchange. The very notion of Hutu and Tutsi as fixed, distinct races is a later, colonial invention. Imagine a society where wealth was measured not in currency but in cattle. The Tutsi, with their large herds, often held positions of power and prestige. The Hutu, primarily cultivators, generally occupied a lower social stratum. But the line between these groups was permeable, not an unbreachable wall. A Hutu who amassed a significant number of cattle could ascend to Tutsi status, while a Tutsi who lost their herd could find themselves considered Hutu. The Twa, distinct from both Hutu and Tutsi, continued their traditional lifestyle, dwelling in the forests, hunting, and gathering. They held a unique place within Rwandan society, often marginalized but also integrated through specific roles, such as potters or entertainers. Their skills and knowledge were valued, even as they remained a smaller, more vulnerable group. By the 15th century, Rwanda was not a unified nation, but a collection of clans, each with its own distinct identity and territory. Gradually, these clans coalesced, weaving together through alliances and conquests, to form larger kingdoms. From this process emerged the Kingdom of Rwanda, a Tutsi monarchy under the Nyaginya clan. This wasn't a sudden takeover, but a slow, organic evolution of power structures, reflecting the growing influence of the Tutsi elite. The Mwami, the king, held a sacred position within Rwandan society, seen as a divine figure, a descendant of the celestial realm. He embodied both political and spiritual authority, his rule intertwined with the rituals and beliefs of the Banyarwanda. The Mwami's power was not absolute, however. He relied on a network of chiefs, both Hutu and Tutsi, to administer his kingdom, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and maintaining order. As the kingdom expanded, its administrative systems became more complex, influencing relations between the Hutu and Tutsi. King Kijli Rwabugiri, a powerful and ambitious ruler of the 19th century, implemented reforms that both strengthened the kingdom and exacerbated existing social tensions. His policies, including Uberedwa, a system of forced labor for Hutu on land seized by the kingdom, and Ubahake, a form of clientage, created a growing rift between the groups. Ubahake was a complex system, a social contract that bound Hutu and Tutsi together in a relationship of mutual obligation. A Tutsi patron would grant a Hutu or Tutsi client access to cattle in exchange for service and loyalty. This wasn't simply economic exploitation, however. It also involved social and political dimensions, with the patron offering protection and support, and the client providing labor and military service. The specifics of ubahake varied across regions, reflecting the diverse social and economic landscapes of the kingdom. Even within the Hutu and Tutsi groups, there was significant diversity. Not all Tutsi were wealthy cattle owners, and not all Hutu were impoverished farmers. There were Tutsi commoners who relied on the patronage of wealthier Tutsis, and there were Hutu who held positions of influence within their communities. This internal diversity adds another layer of complexity to the pre-colonial social structure. The very origins of the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa are shrouded in mystery, with competing narratives offering different perspectives. Some believe the Tutsi migrated from the north, bringing with them their pastoralist traditions, while others argue that the Hutu and Tutsi emerged from a common Bantu ancestor, with their distinctions arising later from social and economic differentiation. The Twa, with their ancient roots in the region, hold a unique place in these narratives, often seen as the original inhabitants. What is clear, despite these competing narratives, is that the Banyarwanda shared a common language, culture, and even clan names. They celebrated the same heroes, honored the same ancestors, and participated in the same rituals. Their shared history, woven together over centuries, created a sense of belonging, a collective identity that transcended the fluid boundaries of Hutu and Tutsi. Imagine a young Tutsi boy learning the art of cattle herding from his father, his days spent tending the family's precious herd, his evenings filled with stories of courageous ancestors and mythical creatures. Or picture a Hutu family gathered around a crackling fire, sharing a meal of freshly harvested crops, their conversation punctuated by laughter and the rhythmic beat of drums. These glimpses into pre-colonial life reveal a society where shared experiences and cultural traditions bound people together, despite social and economic differences. This shared history, rich in nuance and complexity, is essential to understanding the tragic events that would unfold in Rwanda. It wasn't a history of preordained racial hatred, but rather a dynamic interplay of social forces, economic disparities, and evolving power structures, waiting to be manipulated and exploited for political gain. The seeds of division were sown not in ancient animosities, but in the fertile ground of a shared past, twisted and distorted by the forces of colonialism and political ambition. Chapter 2. The Ghosts of Colonization. The pre-colonial Rwandan society, with its fluid social structures and shared cultural heritage, was irrevocably altered by the arrival of European powers. While the Germans, during their brief period of colonial rule, had favored the Tutsi, perceiving them as racially superior, it was the Belgians who systematized and institutionalized this discrimination. Their policies, driven by a combination of racist ideology and administrative expediency, transformed Rwandan society from a fluid, socio-economic system into a rigid, racially defined hierarchy. The most potent symbol of this transformation was the introduction of ethnic identity cards in the 1930s. Imagine a Rwandan family, their lives intertwined for generations, suddenly forced to define themselves according to fixed, immutable categories. These cards, a small piece of paper, became a tool of division, permanently classifying every Rwandan as either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. This seemingly simple act had profound and immediate consequences. The implementation of the identity cards was a meticulous process, a bureaucratic exercise in racial categorization. Belgian administrators, armed with measuring tapes and pseudoscientific theories, traversed the country, scrutinizing the physical features of every Rwandan. The length of one's nose, the height of one's forehead, the color of one's eyes, these became the criteria for determining one's ethnicity. The arbitrary nature of this classification is evident in the numerous accounts of families divided, of individuals whose physical characteristics defied easy categorization. A family, united by blood and shared history, could find themselves split across ethnic lines, their identities determined by the subjective judgment of a colonial administrator. A Hutu family with taller, thinner members might find some of their children classified as Tutsi, while a Tutsi family with shorter, broader features could see their children labeled as Hutu. This arbitrary process not only created confusion and resentment but also undermined the very fabric of Rwandan society. The identity cards, coupled with the Hamitic hypothesis promoted by Christian missionaries, cemented the idea of racial difference in the minds of many Rwandans. The Hamitic hypothesis, a pseudo-scientific theory popular in the early 20th century, posited that certain African groups, including the Tutsi, were descended from a Caucasian, Hamitic race and were thus inherently superior to other African populations. This narrative, readily embraced by Belgian administrators and missionaries, provided a convenient justification for Tutsi privilege and Hutu subordination. Missionaries, entrusted with educating the Rwandan population, often reinforced these racial stereotypes in their teachings. Imagine a young Hutu child, sitting in a mission school, being taught that their Tutsi classmates were descendants of a superior race, destined to rule. This indoctrination, repeated generation after generation, had a devastating impact on the self-perception of both Hutu and Tutsi. The Belgians, by manipulating existing social tensions and imposing a rigid racial classification system, created a system of racial privilege that fueled resentment among the Hutu population. The Tutsi, already occupying a higher social stratum due to their traditional association with cattle herding, were now granted exclusive access to education, administrative positions, and economic opportunities. Hutus, on the other hand, were systematically excluded, their opportunities limited, their aspirations stifled. Specific examples of discriminatory practices abound. Hutus were denied access to secondary education and higher learning, effectively barring them from professional careers. Administrative positions, from local chiefs to government officials, were reserved for Tutsis, further solidifying their control over Rwandan society. Even access to certain jobs, such as those in the burgeoning coffee industry, was determined by ethnicity, with Tutsis given preferential treatment. The economic dimensions of Belgian colonialism further contributed to social unrest. Forced labor, a common practice in colonial Africa, was imposed on the Hutu population, who were required to work on Belgian-owned plantations and infrastructure projects. Rwanda resources, from its fertile land to its valuable minerals, were extracted for the benefit of Belgium, leaving little for the Rwandan people. One can imagine the resentment building within the Hutu community as they witnessed their land being exploited, their labor being extracted, and their opportunities being denied. Stories from this period, passed down through generations, tell of Hutu families forced to work on coffee plantations, their children denied education, their futures bleak. These stories, filled with hardship and injustice, fueled a growing sense of anger and frustration. The long-term consequences of these policies were devastating. The identity cards, the Hamitic hypothesis, the discriminatory practices, the economic exploitation, all of these contributed to creating a fertile ground for future conflict. The Belgians, by manipulating the existing social structure for their administrative and economic gain, left a legacy of division that would haunt Rwanda for decades to come. The ghosts of colonization, embodied in the rigid racial hierarchy and the deep-seated resentment it engendered, would ultimately lead to one of the most horrific genocides in modern history. The seeds of hatred, sown by Belgian colonial rule, would eventually blossom into a nightmare of violence and destruction. Chapter 3: The Rise of Hate. The fragile peace that followed Rwanda independence, marred by intermittent violence and the simmering resentment of displaced Tutsi, proved to be a deceptive calm before the storm. In the decades leading up to the 1994 genocide, a toxic ideology known as Hutu Power took root, twisting history, manipulating cultural narratives, and ultimately paving the way for unimaginable horrors. Hutu Power wasn't merely a political slogan, it was a meticulously crafted ideology that permeated Rwandan society, poisoning minds and fracturing communities. At its core lay the insidious notion that the Tutsi were not truly Rwandan, but foreign invaders, a threat to the Hutu majority and the nation itself. Hutu Power drew on a distorted version of Rwanda history, portraying the Tutsi as historical oppressors who had unjustly dominated the Hutu for centuries. This narrative conveniently ignored the fluidity of pre-colonial social structures and the shared cultural heritage of the Banyarwanda. Instead, it painted a simplistic picture of Hutu victimhood and Tutsi treachery, a narrative that resonated with many Hutu who felt marginalized and disenfranchised in post-colonial Rwanda. Ancient myths and legends were twisted to portray the Tutsi as inherently evil and dangerous. The imagery employed was often dehumanizing, depicting Tutsis as snakes, cockroaches, or other vermin. This dehumanization, a crucial step in the process of genocide, stripped the Tutsi of their humanity, making it easier for Hutu extremists to justify their extermination. Hutu power manifested in various ways, from political discourse to social interactions. Politicians, eager to exploit ethnic tensions for political gain, employed inflammatory rhetoric, demonizing the Tutsi and portraying them as a threat to Rwanda's security. This rhetoric of fear and hatred seeped into everyday life, poisoning relationships between Hutu and Tutsi neighbors and friends. Social interactions became strained, suspicion and mistrust replacing the bonds of community that had once united the Banyarwanda. The Hutu government enacted discriminatory policies that further marginalized the Tutsi. Ethnic quotas were imposed in education and employment, limiting opportunities for Tutsi and reinforcing the notion of Hutu superiority. Tutsis were denied access to government positions and public services, effectively making them second-class citizens. These policies, a stark reminder of the colonial era, created a climate of injustice and inequality that fueled resentment and anger among the Tutsi population. The Rwandan Civil War, which began in 1990 with the Rwandan Patriotic Front's (RPF) invasion from Uganda, became a catalyst for the escalation of Hutu-Tutsi tensions. The Hutu government, led by President Juvenal Habyarimana, seized upon the conflict to further demonize the entire Tutsi population, portraying them as RPF accomplices and traitors, regardless of their actual affiliation with the rebel group. This rhetoric of collective guilt, amplified by a pervasive propaganda campaign, created a climate of fear and paranoia that made the unthinkable seem not only possible, but inevitable. The media became a powerful weapon in the hands of Hutu extremists. Radio stations, most notably RTLM, transformed into instruments of hate propaganda, their airwaves filled with inflammatory messages that dehumanized the Tutsi and incited violence against them. RTLM's broadcasts reached a vast audience, estimated to be over 90% of the population, as radio was the primary source of information for most Rwandans. The station's presenters, using a mix of music, humor, and inflammatory rhetoric, skillfully manipulated their listeners, tapping into existing social anxieties and economic frustrations. RTLM's broadcasts were not simply hateful, they were strategic, employing coded language and direct calls to action. Tutsis were referred to as cockroaches or inyenzi, dehumanizing terms that stripped them of their humanity and made them easier to kill. The station's presenters would often use euphemisms for violence, such as work or cleaning, to incite their listeners to participate in the genocide. They would also broadcast the names and locations of Tutsi individuals, effectively marking them for death. Kangura, a widely circulated newspaper, played a similar role in spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories about Tutsi. Its pages were filled with articles and cartoons that depicted Tutsis as a threat to Rwanda's security and stability. The Hutu Ten Commandments, a chilling manifesto published in Kangura, codified the principles of Hutu power, promoting ethnic segregation and inciting violence against the Tutsi. Kangura, with its inflammatory rhetoric and graphic imagery, reached a significant portion of the literate population, further fueling the flames of hatred. It falsely claimed that the Tutsi were planning to exterminate the Hutu, a classic example of projection, a psychological defense mechanism where one attributes their own unacceptable thoughts or feelings to another. The Civil War provided a convenient backdrop for the intensification of propaganda. The RPF invasion and subsequent fighting were used by the Hutu government to fuel fear and paranoia about Tutsi, both those associated with the RPF and those within Rwanda. Every RPF attack, every instance of violence, was presented as evidence of the Tutsis' inherent treachery and their supposed plan to overthrow the Hutu government and reinstate Tutsi domination. This narrative of imminent threat, repeated ad nauseum by the media, created a sense of urgency and desperation among the Hutu population, making them more receptive to extremist messages. Specific instances of massacres and violence, often triggered by propaganda or used to further justify its message, punctuated the escalating tensions. In October 1990, just days after the RPF invasion, Hutu militias, incited by government propaganda, massacred hundreds of Tutsi civilians in Kibalira commune. This massacre, far from the front lines of the civil war, demonstrated the power of propaganda to incite violence and foreshadowed the horrors to come. The wartime conditions facilitated the spread of propaganda and limited access to alternative information sources. The government controlled the media, suppressing dissenting voices and ensuring that its message of hate reached every corner of the country. Independent newspapers were shut down, journalists were intimidated and harassed, and access to international news was restricted. This information vacuum, coupled with the pervasive fear and paranoia generated by the civil war, created an environment where propaganda could flourish. The impact of the propaganda campaign on daily life and social interactions in Rwandan communities was devastating. Neighbors turned on neighbors, friends betrayed friends, and even families were torn apart. Trust eroded, replaced by suspicion and fear. Social gatherings became tense and awkward, as Hutu and Tutsi, once united by shared traditions and cultural practices, now viewed each other with mistrust. One could imagine the hushed conversations, the furtive glances, the unspoken anxieties that permeated everyday life. Local officials and community leaders played a key role in disseminating propaganda and mobilizing participation in violence. They organized meetings, distributed hate literature, and encouraged Hutu civilians to join the militias. They also identified Tutsi individuals and families, marking them for death. These local actors, often respected members of their communities, became instruments of the genocide, their authority lending credibility to the extremist messages. The escalating tensions manifested in specific locations and communities. In some regions, Hutu militias, emboldened by propaganda and armed with machetes, began carrying out small-scale attacks on Tutsi civilians. These attacks, often brutal and indiscriminate, served as a prelude to the genocide, testing the waters and gauging the level of resistance. In other communities, the propaganda campaign fueled social ostracization and economic discrimination against Tutsi, creating a climate of fear and intimidation. The planning and preparation for the genocide were meticulous and systematic. Hutu militias, such as the Interahamwe, were trained in combat and indoctrinated with Hutu Power ideology. Weapons, primarily machetes, were distributed to Hutu civilians, transforming ordinary people into potential killers. Lists of Tutsi targets were compiled, identifying individuals and families to be eliminated. These preparations, carried out in secret, revealed the chilling intent of Hutu extremists. In the months and weeks leading up to the genocide, the atmosphere in Rwanda was thick with tension and fear. The propaganda campaign had reached a fever pitch, its messages of hate and paranoia echoing across the country. Rumors of impending violence circulated, fueling anxieties and prompting many Tutsi to flee their homes in search of safety. Those who remained lived in a state of constant fear, their lives hanging in the balance. The stage was set for a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. Chapter 4. A World Turned Away. The Rwandan genocide was not a spontaneous eruption of tribal violence. It was a meticulously planned extermination campaign, executed with chilling efficiency. And as the machinery of genocide was being assembled, the international community, despite possessing ample warning signs, stood by, its response ranging from hesitant to indifferent. This inaction, a tragic tapestry woven with political calculations, bureaucratic inertia, and a chilling lack of empathy, allowed the genocide to unfold with horrifying speed and efficiency. The warnings were not whispers in the dark, but clear, urgent alarms, sounded by those who saw the gathering storm. As early as 1993, human rights organizations documented a disturbing pattern of escalating violence and inflammatory rhetoric. Reports detailed the distribution of machetes, the formation of extremist militias, and the dissemination of hate propaganda through radio broadcasts and newspapers. These reports painted a grim picture of a nation teetering on the brink of mass violence, a nation desperately in need of international attention and intervention. The most chilling warning came from within the UN peacekeeping force itself. In January 1994, Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian commander of UNAMIR, sent a cable to the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, detailing a meeting with a high-level informant. This informant, a member of the Presidential Guard, revealed a plan to exterminate Tutsi and moderate Hutu, a plan that included the training of militias and the compilation of hit lists. Dallaire requested permission to seize the weapons caches identified by the informant, a request that could have significantly disrupted the genocide's planning and execution. This cable, now infamously known as the Genocide Fax, was a desperate plea for action, a plea that tragically went unheeded. The UN's response to these warnings was tragically inadequate. The initial UNAMIR mandate, established under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, was severely limited. It focused on monitoring the ceasefire between the Rwandan government and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, and assisting in the implementation of the Arusha Accords, a power-sharing agreement. It did not authorize the use of force to protect civilians, a critical flaw that would have devastating consequences. The Security Council, the body responsible for authorizing and deploying peacekeeping operations, debated the situation in Rwanda, but its deliberations were hampered by political divisions and a reluctance to intervene in what some member states perceived as an internal conflict. The influence of key member states, particularly those with a history of intervention in Africa, played a significant role in shaping the UN's response. The United States, haunted by the memory of the 1993 Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, where 18 American soldiers were killed, adopted a policy of extreme caution towards interventions in Africa. The Somalia experience had a profound impact on U.S. foreign policy, fostering a reluctance to commit troops to complex and potentially dangerous peacekeeping operations. This reluctance, coupled with a lack of strategic interest in Rwanda, shaped the U.S. response to the escalating crisis. As the genocide began, the U.S. government actively lobbied against a stronger UN intervention, arguing that the conflict was an internal matter, a tribal war beyond the scope of international involvement. Instead of advocating for increased troop deployments and a mandate to protect civilians, the U.S. prioritized the evacuation of its own citizens and other foreign nationals, leaving Rwandans to their fate. Statements from U.S. officials at the time reveal a chilling indifference to the unfolding tragedy. Belgium, the former colonial power in Rwanda, initially deployed a contingent of peacekeepers as part of UNAMIR. However, following the murder of 10 Belgian soldiers assigned to protect Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana, Belgium withdrew its forces, a decision that had a devastating impact on the UN's ability to protect civilians. The withdrawal of the Belgian peacekeepers sent a clear message to the perpetrators of the genocide: the world was not coming to Rwanda rescue. France, which had close ties to the Hutu-led government, played a complex and controversial role in the Rwandan genocide. While France later deployed troops under Operation Turquoise, ostensibly to create a safe humanitarian zone, the operation has been criticized for its limited scope and its alleged protection of Hutu officials and militias involved in the genocide. The French government's actions during this period remain a subject of intense debate and scrutiny. African nations, too, struggled to respond effectively to the crisis. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, the continent's premier intergovernmental organization, lacked the resources and political will to intervene in Rwanda. Individual African countries, grappling with their own internal challenges, were hesitant to commit troops to a complex and dangerous peacekeeping operation. The international media, while reporting on the unfolding events, failed to capture the full horror and scale of the genocide. The coverage was often sporadic and superficial, lacking the depth and urgency needed to galvanize international action. While some journalists and news organizations did highlight the atrocities being committed, their reports were often overshadowed by other international events, and their impact on the international response was limited. The UN Security Council, influenced by the reluctance of powerful member states to intervene, gradually reduced the UNAMIR force, effectively abandoning Rwanda to its fate. The timeline of troop reductions is a chilling testament to the international community's failure to act. As the killing intensified, the number of peacekeepers on the ground dwindled, leaving them powerless to stop the genocide. The reasons for this inaction were complex and multifaceted. Political calculations, logistical challenges, a lack of political will, and the shadow of Somalia all played a role. Some argued that the conflict was an internal matter, a tribal war beyond the scope of international intervention. Others cited the complexity of the situation and the lack of readily available resources. Still others simply didn't care. The consequences of this inaction were devastating. Hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were slaughtered while the world watched. Families were decimated, communities were destroyed, and a nation was scarred forever. The failure to intervene in Rwanda remains a dark stain on the conscience of the international community, a stark reminder of the human cost of indifference. The world turned away, and the consequences were catastrophic. The ghosts of those who perished during the Rwandan genocide haunt us still, a constant reminder of the urgent need for a more effective and compassionate international response to genocide and mass atrocities. Chapter 5. Whispers of Reconciliation. The dust settled, the machetes were laid down, and the echoes of screams faded into an unnerving silence. Rwanda, in July 1994, was a graveyard. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by Paul Kagame, had ended the genocide, but the nation was in ruins, its social fabric shredded, its people traumatized beyond comprehension. Over 800,000 lay dead, a staggering number in a country of roughly 7 million. The task of rebuilding, of somehow piecing together a nation from the fragments of genocide, was a task of Herculean proportions. It was in this desolate landscape that the whispers of reconciliation began, tentative, fragile, yet undeniably present. The new government, born from the ashes of genocide, declared unity and reconciliation its guiding principles. This was not merely political rhetoric, it was a necessity, a desperate attempt to prevent the nation from collapsing into further violence. One of the first, symbolic steps was the removal of ethnic distinctions from identity cards. These cards, once tools of division and discrimination, were now stripped of their power to categorize and separate. The very act of carrying an identity card became a declaration of Rwandanness, not Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. But symbolism alone could not heal the deep wounds of genocide. Laws were passed, criminalizing genocide ideology and divisionism. These were not vague pronouncements, but concrete legal measures designed to prevent the recurrence of the horrors that had just transpired. Genocide ideology was defined as any act or speech that promoted hatred or discrimination based on ethnicity, while divisionism encompassed any act that sought to divide Rwandans along ethnic lines. These laws, while sometimes criticized for being too broad or restrictive, aimed to create a legal framework for promoting unity and preventing the resurgence of extremist ideologies. For example, denying the genocide, spreading rumors that incite hatred, or forming an organization based on ethnic division became punishable offenses. One of the most significant and controversial initiatives was the establishment of the Gacaca courts. These community-based courts, drawing on traditional Rwandan justice practices, were designed to address the sheer number of perpetrators, estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands. The sheer scale of the genocide had overwhelmed the conventional justice system, and the Gacaca courts offered a unique approach to dealing with the massive backlog of cases. Imagine a village gathering, not in celebration, but in the somber pursuit of justice and healing. The Gacaca courts were held outdoors, under the shade of trees, in open fields, or in community centers. Elected judges, chosen from within the community, presided over the proceedings. Victims and their families shared their stories, their testimonies raw and heartbreaking. Perpetrators confessed their crimes, often in excruciating detail, seeking forgiveness from their victims and their communities. The Gacaca process prioritized restorative justice and community healing over retribution. The focus was not simply on punishment, but on uncovering the truth, acknowledging the harm done, and facilitating reconciliation between victims and perpetrators. Perpetrators who confessed their crimes and expressed remorse were often given reduced sentences, including community service. This approach, while controversial, aimed to reintegrate perpetrators back into society, to rebuild the social fabric that had been torn apart by the genocide. The Gacaca courts were not without their critics. Some argued that they lacked due process and legal safeguards, that the elected judges were not adequately trained, and that the emphasis on confession and forgiveness could lead to false accusations and coerced confessions. Others criticized the Gacaca courts for their limited ability to address the crimes of high-ranking officials and for their potential to exacerbate existing social tensions. Despite these criticisms, the Gacaca courts played a significant role in the post-genocide justice process, offering a unique and culturally relevant approach to dealing with the legacy of violence. While the Gacaca courts focused on local-level justice and reconciliation, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, established by the UN, pursued justice at the international level. The ICTR's mandate was to prosecute high-ranking officials responsible for planning and executing the genocide. Its trials, held in Arusha, Tanzania, brought to justice some of the most notorious figures of the genocide, including former Prime Minister Jean Kambanda, who became the first head of government to be convicted of genocide by an international tribunal. The ICTR's work was not without its challenges. The tribunal faced criticism for its slow pace, its high cost, and its limited ability to reach the vast majority of perpetrators. However, the ICTR played a crucial role in establishing international legal precedents for genocide and crimes against humanity, and its judgments served as a powerful symbol of international justice. The ICTR's conviction of media executives for inciting genocide through hate speech set a landmark precedent, highlighting the role of the media in fueling violence. Beyond the legal and institutional initiatives, the whispers of reconciliation found expression in the personal stories of Rwandans grappling with the aftermath. Imagine a Tutsi woman, her family decimated by the genocide, encountering the man who confessed to killing her husband and children in a Gacaca court. Imagine the unimaginable. The possibility of forgiveness, of rebuilding trust, of coexisting in a community scarred by violence. These were not abstract concepts but lived realities for countless Rwandans. There were Hutu who risked their lives to protect Tutsi neighbors during the genocide, and there were Tutsi who, after the genocide, offered forgiveness to those who had confessed their crimes. These acts of courage and compassion, often born from deep faith and a commitment to rebuilding their communities, were the true whispers of reconciliation. The practical challenges faced by survivors were immense. Many had lost everything: their families, their homes, their livelihoods. They faced economic hardship, psychological trauma, and the constant fear of renewed violence. The Rwandan government, with the support of international organizations, implemented a range of programs and initiatives designed to support survivors and foster healing. These included economic assistance programs, trauma counseling services, and educational initiatives focused on promoting peace and reconciliation. One example is the Avega Agahozo, an association of genocide widows, which provides economic support, education, and healthcare to its members. The organization empowers widows to become self-sufficient, to rebuild their lives, and to contribute to the healing of their communities. Another example is the Survivors Fund, SURF, which provides educational support to orphans and vulnerable children affected by the genocide. These organizations, and many others, played a vital role in supporting survivors and fostering reconciliation. The path towards reconciliation has been long and arduous, marked by both progress and setbacks. The wounds of the genocide run deep, and the challenges of rebuilding trust and fostering a shared national identity remain. There are different perspectives on justice and forgiveness within Rwanda, reflecting the diverse experiences and traumas of its people. Some survivors struggle with the notion of forgiving those who committed such horrific crimes, while others see forgiveness as a necessary step towards healing and moving forward. The government's attempts to create a shared national identity have been met with both success and criticism. The Ndi Umunyarwanda, I Am Rwandan campaign, launched in 2013, aimed to promote a sense of shared national identity and to discourage ethnic divisions. The campaign encouraged Rwandans to identify themselves as Rwandans first and foremost, rather than as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. While the campaign has been praised for its efforts to promote unity, it has also been criticized for potentially suppressing dissent and glossing over the complexities of Rwanda history. The long-term effects of the genocide on Rwandan society are profound and far-reaching. The genocide not only decimated the population but also shattered the social fabric, leaving a legacy of trauma and mistrust. The government's efforts to promote unity and reconciliation, while commendable, have not fully addressed the deep-seated psychological and emotional scars of the genocide. The ongoing challenges to reconciliation are numerous and complex. The legacy of trauma, the persistence of genocide ideology in some segments of society, the challenges of economic development, and the restrictions on political freedom all pose significant obstacles to lasting peace and reconciliation. Various initiatives, including educational programs, community dialogues, and psychosocial support services, are being implemented to address these challenges. Organizations like the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission continue to work towards fostering dialogue, promoting healing, and building a more inclusive and just society. The whispers of reconciliation, once tentative and fragile, have grown louder over the years, but they are still whispers, not a resounding chorus. The ghosts of the past still linger, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace and the importance of vigilance in preventing future atrocities. Rwanda's journey towards reconciliation is far from over, but the whispers of hope, the acts of courage and compassion, the commitment to rebuilding a nation from the ashes of genocide, offer a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring possibility of healing and forgiveness. Pre-colonial Rwanda saw fluid social structures, not rigid ethnic divisions. Colonial powers, particularly Belgium, imposed racial classifications and discriminatory policies that exacerbated existing tensions, fueling the rise of Hutu Power ideology and culminating in the 1994 genocide. International inaction, despite ample warning signs, allowed the atrocities to unfold. Post-genocide Rwanda has focused on reconciliation through legal measures, community courts, and individual acts of forgiveness, but challenges remain. These historical lessons underscore the dangers of ethnic division and the importance of international intervention in preventing genocide. What are your thoughts on Rwanda's path to reconciliation? Share your comments below. Subscribe for more explorations of history and its impact. Never stop learning.